Greetings, Earthlings. Willkommen. So today I'd like to talk about something that is, quite ironically, near and dear to my heart, and that is Stoicism, as I've learned about through reading the Discourses by Epictetus and the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor long ago, and Epictetus was a slave. So something to think about when learning about Stoicism is one could say that, well, it's easy to be a Stoic when you're privileged, but Epictetus is an example of how valuable and how possible it is to be a Stoic when you are absolutely not privileged, when you are quite literally a slave. So to get into it, so Stoicism hinges on really one fundamental question for you to ask yourself, and that is, what do I have control over and what don't I? So immediately, Stoicism separates the world into those two categories, which are control and negation, not control, no control. So for Stoicism, really the only thing, providing you are mentally healthy, you have control over is yourself. Everything outside of you, all circumstances, outside of yourself are, of course, outside of your control. So that means really death, loss, other people, the planet you live on, the structure of your existence, quite literally everything that is not you and your mental self are things which are outside of your control. And so for Stoicism, how you are to deal with your emotions and your attachments and the things you care about are to understand first most that you don't have control over anything other than yourself. So therefore, the only thing you ought to be emotionally invested in or grieve over are those things in yourself which you do not properly take care of, or which you don't nurture, or of which you abuse, or of which you really act, anything you do that is contrary to what is good for you or for yourself or for you to do to others, that is something for you to be concerned about, your own self-development. However, circumstances, so things like, let's say there's a disaster of some sort, or someone breaks up with you, or you get sick, or someone you love dies, or anything of that nature, anything which really people typically grieve over, really, think about all the things that people grieve over and become attached to and get emotional about. Typically, those are almost always things that are outside of people's control. They all have to do with external circumstances, not the internal self. I mean, of course, there are cases in which these issues have to do with the internal self, which one grieves over, but more often than not, it is circumstance. And for Stoicism, it is wholly, completely irrational to grieve over circumstances which are outside of your control. The only thing that you need to concern yourself with is yourself. So you're probably thinking, well, that's a lot easier said than done. But that's the thing about it, is that it has to come from a place of understanding. So you need to understand that the nature of your existence is structured such that you don't have control over anything but yourself. That means that over the course of your life, you will inevitably experience death, loss, suffering, grief, anything bad that could possibly happen. At least a quarter of it is going to happen, including your own death. So bad things happen. For Stoicism, how you deal with them is by understanding that they are just a fact of the matter, that you must just accept them and control only your reaction to them. That is wherein the power of controlling one's emotions lies, is in understanding that the only things that you need to be authentically emotional or concerned about are those things you have control over, and to use that control you have to understand that the nature of existence is such that poor circumstances will occur, and the only thing you can control is how you react to them. So in that way, In that way, a lot of people don't like Stoicism, and a lot of people don't get along well with Stoics. So some people tend to find, I've had to, adjust myself since I first started, diving into Stoicism, because it's very difficult to interact with people who don't understand Stoicism or who think it's absurd. So when you say, it's not the best thing, for example, if somebody loses someone, to say, that's just the structure of existence. People don't like that. As true as it is, most people don't like it because they're so invested in, being upset over their losses and whatnot. And that's not to say that one ought not to be obsessed or not be concerned with their losses. And it's an extremely difficult thing to do. So, for example, Buddhism. So Buddhism takes a similar approach to life. It says that the only thing one sort of has in their control is themselves. Everything else outside of oneself, one does not have control over, because the very nature of existence is change. It's flux, it's impermanence, everything, including you, me, this house, the floor, the ceiling, this board, the stars, the planets, everything is in a constant state of change, moving towards its own demise or death in some capacity. Whether or not those deaths give rise to new things or not, everything is constantly changing. And because everything's constantly changing, nothing is in fact permanent. So therefore, that's why you often hear Buddhists say that life is as such an illusion, because everything is constantly changing and everything is outside of your control. So the Buddhist says, therefore, that one ought not to have any attachments to anything. One ought to learn to love things and to exist in the world without being attached to things or things in the world, and so on. One needs to just learn to live independently while enjoying but not being attached. So the point of my story is when I was studying Indian philosophy in my third year of university, a story one of my Indian philosophy professor told us was he was talking about about some monastery in Asia, and one of the head teachers there, one of the head monks, he was married and he lost his wife. His wife died. And one day one of his students found him, shortly after the death, basically in a corner crying, holding, his face in his hands and just grieving. And the student said to him, well, you've told us that all of life is an illusion and not to form attachments, so why the hell are you sitting here crying? And, through, his tears and his hands and his face, he said, she was the most beautiful illusion that I've ever seen. So that goes to show, my point is that even the most trained people, even the ones who are supposed to teach these things, it is even difficult for them to come to terms with things because our emotions are so powerful. But the point of Buddhism and of Stoicism is that just having that understanding of the existence in which you're embedded can help to mitigate these sufferings when they occur or when they arise. Because fundamentally, when you approach these negatives as they occur to you, as they, certainly will, when you approach it with, the attitude, why is this happening to me? Life is so cruel and unfair, and I can't believe this, I'm so sad, and you just, sulk in your misery for, an indeterminate amount of time, the Stoic would say that you're doing that to yourself. There's a certain point at which you need to just understand that this is just how things are. You can be upset, but don't, prolong it by not understanding the situation or by trying to rebel against the nature of existence. It's counterintuitive. It's not intelligent to do so. So what you ought to do then is to allow yourself to grieve in some capacity for these things, but to fundamentally understand that that's just how it is. It's just the nature of things. The only thing you have control over is you yourself and how you react. So I firmly believe that a healthy degree of non-attachment can be reached by simply invoking that understanding whenever you meet a circumstance that is out of your control but which oppresses you or causes you to suffer in some way. And you have to tell yourself that, well, it's just the nature of things. And it's not easy. It is not easy. It will not happen for you, overnight. But the more you do it, the more you sort of train yourself to experience these things differently and more maturely, right? A common saying in psychology or neuroscience is that neurons that fire together wire together. That's when you train yourself to act in certain ways, your brain is firing in a new way, and the more it does that, the more those pathways in which neurons are firing become hardwired over time, and it becomes easier for you to deal with these things. So I hope I have captured that, sufficiently. But yes, so I strongly encourage this method, but at the same time, I absolutely acknowledge that, suffering is important. It really is. Some of the greatest, the greatest aspects of human creativity, the very come from the depths of suffering. Like, some of the greatest music I've ever heard has come from the depths of despair. Some of the greatest works, the greatest, all of these things, films, there's so many things, so many aspects of human creativity that come from suffering, and I'm not saying to, get rid of suffering entirely, because it's, it's evidenced by that monk, it's not really completely possible to do so. What is possible, however, on an individual level, is to make these inevitable situations of suffering easier for yourself by always approaching it with that understanding, and not letting it completely consume you. So, as someone who has, at times in their life, been completely consumed, this has helped.